What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Bridging the Gap here on the Jersey First TV network. I'm AJ Malillo,
I'm Steven Rambola.
and as always, subscribe to Jersey First TV on YouTube to get all of our content. You get Bridging the Gap, you get the Nader Narrative, you get Real Talk with Fernando. You can also check us out on jerseyfirst.org. And on jerseyfirst.org, you can sign up for our newsletter, get content straight to your email, and you can also sign our pledge of making New Jersey a better state and place to live. So check us out, subscribe, sign up, do all you got to do. Check out Jersey First. But this is Bridging the Gap, and we have a great show for you folks, don't we, Steven?
I would say we do.
I would say we do too. How has your week been, Mr. Rumbola?
You know what? I don't know if you can tell by the heaviness in my eyes, but it's one of those weeks. And it seems like every week is one of those weeks.
Fair.
A lot of pressure. Obviously the time to make a decision about law school is, I would say, creeping, but it feels like it's like the bullet train just hurling at me.
Hurling.
So, we have that approaching. I'm in the process of transitioning potentially to a new job. So we got that hurling, and then just general life, remaining sound in the commitments I've made to myself, the daily practices, my commitment to the gym, fitness, nutrition, all those things. So kind of working the balancing act of life. Some days you hit it and you're like, guru, I have this. And then some days you wake up and all of a sudden it's 9:30 and you have to record a show at 10 in the morning. You know what I mean?
Sure.
So, other than that, it's been great. Enjoying my book. Looking forward to a period of peace, hopefully after I make those decisions and get settled into a new position. And aside from that, just rocking and rolling, taking every day for what it is, a gift to be here. So
That's right. That's
that's all you
right.
could ask for. How about you?
You know what? As you were talking, I thought this is really funny because I feel like we oftentimes have the opposite where it's like I'm hitting a wall and you're like kind of not coasting isn't the right word, but like you're feeling it, you know? And I
Uh-huh.
feel like today we're at opposite ends, right? I'm kind of feeling it today. Like I'm one of those days where I'm like, I got this, everything's under control, we're making it through. That's not to say I don't have a lot going on or to say that you usually don't have a lot going on. But like today's one of those days where I'm like, you know what? I feel good. I can do this. I've already been on two separate walks this morning. I walked the dog
Woo!
before I left the house, got to school, went on another walk. It was nice. So I'm like feeling good right now. We'll see. Maybe, in about 6 hours after a couple classes and, and doing some
Yeah.
work, I might feel a little bit different, but it is what it is. I'm feeling good. Um, I haven't started my book for March yet, but I'm ready to push through. I was trying to finish up something I was reading before, and then
Uh,
start the new book. So I'm probably going to start my book for March this weekend.
Very
I
nice.
think so. I'm excited, very excited for that. And I was just talking to another buddy of mine who I go to school with about this last night, and I'll give you similar advice. Not that you necessarily need it, but for the listeners and for you, Stephen, what I've realized lately on the best way to approach when you have a lot of things coming up. Like I have two big papers coming up, plus all of my like normal work, plus finals are like creeping around the corner at this point. Take the day in front of you for what it's worth and just do what you have to do today and then take the same approach tomorrow and the next day. And then by the end of the week, you get what you needed to get done also, but you're not stressing yourself out. It's like, oh, I got to do this by Friday. I got to do this by next Tuesday. It's like, okay, what do you have that needs to be done tomorrow? Get that done first today, and then work on what maybe needs to be done later. And a little bit, do a little bit today, and a little bit tomorrow, and then a little bit the next day. And if you work on what you have to do for tomorrow, today, then by the end of the week, you'll be like, okay, I had that due Friday, but since I did a little bit every day, plus, but focused on what was due the next day, it was easier to get through that process. And you don't get overwhelmed by like, oh, I have so much to do this week. Just kind of take what's in front of you instead of worrying about what's 2 weeks down the road.
That is quite prolific. How would you suggest that we like make that macro? Because I would say I just exist in existentialism, so it's sort of like I need to have this done by Friday, but it's more like if I don't do this now in 30 years, uh, things are going to be chaotic.
Right, right. Well, I think that that's funny, but I think what you have to do literally is just work on what you can work on today. And if you continue to just take it literally day by day, okay, this is what I have to do today. The 30 years down the line, it will work out because you've done what you had to do every single day. You know what I mean? Like it's not worrying about 30 years because 30 years will work out if today works out. And I
That
think
was the soundbite. That was the
that
soundbite right there. That's what we needed.
I think that if when we get caught up in the future too much, and that's not to say don't think about the future because I think that's a mistake too. But if we get caught up in the future too much, we push off today.
Yeah,
And then we get lost in the sauce, and you don't want to get lost in the sauce.
you definitely don't want to get lost in the sauce.
Exactly. And you know what happens when
Definitely
you
do
get
not.
lost in the sauce?
What's that?
Major bank failures. And that's what
Yeah,
we saw, and that's what we're going to talk
yeah,
about today.
yeah. They did get lost in the sauce, didn't they? Whew.
See, their problem was
Um,
they weren't thinking about the future, and we'll get into that.
well, I mean, they started off thinking about the future, but then the Fed did some things, and they were like, "Well, the future's not looking too good." And then Goldman Sachs made $100 million. That's the moral of every story.
Ain't that the
Something
truth?
happened. Goldman Sachs made $100 million.
Exactly.
Oh boy, yeah. So obviously, what you had just alluded to, we're going to talk about Silicon Valley Bank, um, and the wonderful little collapse that they had, which happened to be the biggest of a U.S. bank since 2008, when we had a bunch of that happening.
Yeah,
um,
since the Lehman Brothers, and also, before we get deep into the story, I just want to note that today we're recording this on Friday. So today there was a big report that came out about First Republic Bank, and they're getting bought out by or sort of supported and lifted up by some other competitors in the market. And there's a big Swiss bank. I'm blanking on the name off the top of my
yes,
head.
I
That
think
is
it's literally
also
like Suisse or something.
yeah, it's like the
Suisse.
biggest Swiss bank, and they're struggling to stay afloat, but they're trying their best over there. But that's just a little bit of background as we are still looking at and hopefully dealing and managing this market. But we'll talk about Silicon Valley Bank now.
Yes. So I do want to say, as a point before all of this, uh, money things confuse me a little bit when we're talking about bonds and holdings and savings and loans, and on this really macro, like macroeconomics is just to me a little bit confusing.
I think it is to
So
most people. So we're going to work through this together as a
yeah,
group.
we're gonna get through this. I have, as you can see here, I normally take notes for the show, but I've gone like off the wall this week with the notes that I need, um, to guide me in the right direction, to make sure that I have all the information that I think is important to talk about. So I think before we address sort of the fallout of the collapse of this bank and what that all means for the market and the things that we should be worrying about today, the most important thing for me was kind of having a background understanding of what Silicon Valley Bank is, because as I read, I learned a lot that they aren't exactly like your regular bank. And they were set up in this really, I would say, until they collapsed, advantageous position where they were supporting a lot of venture based capitalist, you know, startups, specifically in Silicon Valley that deals, sort of in this tech realm. They were the 16th largest bank in the United States, but many people probably had never heard of them until last week. So, started in 1983, relatively new. I know the bank that you were referencing out in Europe started in like 1616. So, that also goes to show you that this instability in the market right now is affecting institutions old and new, which, take that for what you will. I'm not an economist. So Silicon Valley Bank, by December 31st of last year, I was reading, they had over $209 billion in assets and $175 billion in deposits sitting in their bank. So they were in charge and they were managing quite the fund in regards to what they had. 44% of U.S. venture-backed tech and healthcare IPOs, which are public options that are traded on the stock market, essentially, banked with SVB. So you're talking almost half of healthcare and tech venture-backed companies had money in SVB. And around 90% of their accounts sitting in SVB had more than $250,000. That is a really important number for the discussion today, depending on how we want to take this. And for context, $250,000 is the amount that the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission, I think it's commission, insures depositors to banks. Meaning if the bank can't pay you your money, corporation. Meaning if the bank can't pay you your money, if they go under, you are insured in your deposit up to $250,000.
Right.
Which,
And really quick, that's like every bank you go into, there's a little like sticker that says like FDIC insured. And that was, dating back to the Great Depression when we had those bank runs to make sure that people didn't completely lose all of their money when a bank went under.
ready? So the FDIC, I actually did some research on this, founded in 1933. And I thought it was interesting because two Democrats wrote the bill that, had sort of founded it. And it was to protect originally deposits up to $2,500 for the bankers in rural America, who at the time were obviously upset with the, coastal elitists out on Wall Street who were banking and making them lose all their money. So this was really a program that was made to secure the rest of the country, people who didn't understand why the stock market collapsed. Why? Because they walked into their bank, however many hundreds of miles away from Wall Street, they couldn't get their money. And as time has gone on, looking for it.
No, I was just yes, but I think what's important to note is like really, really fundamentally how banks work, because they don't just keep your money in
Yes.
like a vault in the back. Like they don't just have cash on hand. It's not liquid cash. You put money into your account, they take that money and they invest that money into other places to gain interest, to get a cash flow. And then, if you have a couple $100 in a checking account, sure, they probably have that on hand. If you have a couple $1,000, they might not. So you want to take that money out. They have to sell some of those assets that they are gaining interest on, or at least gather some of the interest to liquidate that money to give it to you. The best way to explain it is as it's explained in It's a Wonderful Life with the Bailey's Building and Loans, where everybody comes in during Black Tuesday, during the Great Depression, and they're like, we need our money. And he's like, but I don't have your money. Your money is in his house, and his money is in her house. And like, I don't have the money here in a safe. I have some cash. And then he gives out, the cash that he has, which actually wasn't even in the safe. It was like his own personal money in the movie. But that's how it's done, right? Like your money isn't actually sitting in the back of the bank. It's being used in other endeavors. So I think that that's a little bit of a confusion, and exactly why the FDIC exists is because people didn't understand that the money is not in the back. The money is being used for other projects. It's not liquid.
Yes. So carrying on with the point about the FDIC then, and I think that's important, like you said, because when it comes to insuring these deposits, it's sort of to protect against almost what you just described there, which is if these people showed up, he didn't have the money, he could say, hey, I don't have the money, but because you bank with me and because the FDIC exists, even though I don't have it, it exists somewhere and it'll be accessible to you up to X amount, right? So that number that the FDIC insures has had increases obviously throughout time, because Quite literally, it's 100 times what it was when it
Well,
was
inflation.
founded. Yes. So the last time that they approved a increase in the amount insured was after 2008. Prior to that, the number basically from the 80s was $100,000, and then after 2008, they approved that. I guess I would call it a jump in what they protect to $250,000. So, having all that information, we're going to double down now. We're going to talk about the things that in my research stuck out to me as what led to the failure of SVB. So they were buying these treasury bonds,
Right.
which again,
So treasury bonds are usually a super safe asset for a bank to buy. Usually when a bank is like looking to make safe money and interests get interest back, treasury bonds are the way to go, because basically you're giving money to the US government. The US government will pay you back with interest. And that's usually a pretty safe bet
yeah.
over the long term. Where that fails and where SVB went wrong in this particular interest in getting the treasury bonds is that when interest rates rise, your treasury bond that you buy at a lower interest rates loses its value. Because why would I buy the treasury bond from you at say 4% interest if the interest rate's now 7% and I can get it at 7% interest? Obviously I'm going to buy that one, right? So what happened was when the coronavirus was going on, the economy was flush with all of this liquid cash. Businesses didn't know what to do with it. They put it into the bank. The bank now has all of this liquid cash. So what do? They think, okay, well, we have a lot of money on hand. We need to invest this money. We can't have it on hand because that also loses value because of inflation. So we put it in these treasury bonds, not thinking that, wait, hold on. There's all of this liquid cash. Eventually, the economy is going to dictate, the Fed is going to have to raise interest rates because they're going to have to quell spending, because they're going to have to quell inflation. So naturally interest rates are going to rise. That is like basic econ 101.
Mm-hmm.
And so when interest rates rose, which was inevitable because we flushed the economy with cash, all of that money, basically all of those treasury bonds that they invested in, were useless. No one was going to buy them, or they had to sell at a
Yes.
loss.
Yes, they did sell at a loss. They sold them for a $1.8 billion loss, actually. And that news is what caused the run on the bank. But furthermore, what I thought was interesting was they had over half of their assets, which, if you recall, was a ridiculous number, about $209 billion, were sitting in these long maturing treasury bonds. So there was not enough attention paid, it seems, in the people who made these investing decisions at SVB to correlate exactly what you just said and say, hey, half of our assets are in these things. You're talking $100 billion, and they are becoming less valuable. Big problem. And the intention, like you said, and the bonds that they had purchased are these long maturing bonds, which means that the return that they're going to receive on them, I think, is a period of almost 30 years. Most of the bonds that they bought were 30-year bonds. Couple that with the fact that most of the people that put money in their bank were these tech startups, which notoriously take a very long time to show return on the initial investment. So they have half of their assets sitting in these bonds, which take a guaranteed 30 years. When you buy a 30-year bond, you know that in 30 years you're going to get your money to show profit. And they've invested, most of their accounts are in these startups that take, on average, over a decade to show return. So they are pushing out all of this cash. No time in the future, anytime soon, is any of that really coming back in any meaningful way. And then you take all of that and you couple it with the fact that they sell this for a loss. People get panicked, and only 10% of the accounts held at SVB sat underneath that FDIC $250,000 insured number, meaning
I
that
think
90% of their accounts and depositors had more than that money, which meant when it was gone, those people are not guaranteed to get that anymore.
Well, I think that the most telling account in that bank, and I believe it was over $300 million in one checking account for Roku Inc.
Yes.
Over $300 million in one checking account. Look, I'm not an economist. You're not an economist. It doesn't take an economist or a rocket scientist to figure out that if $250,000 is what's insured, that's pretty much the most you should be keeping in an account at one time, and you
Yes.
should spread out your money.
You would imagine. I
And
mean, we both have very personal experience with this. Our moms both worked in the banking industry for quite some time. And I
Yeah.
remember being a kid and I learned what the FDIC was. And I was like, so when I make that amount of money, if I have more than that, I should get another account, right? And my mom was like, yes, that is the whole point of this. Like,
Right.
you need to diversify your portfolio. You need to be in all these other banks. That's why companies have so many different accounts, is because
Except
you
for
want to make sure.
apparently Roku Inc.
Roku Inc. Yeah. You want to make sure that you can get your money. You want to make sure you can get your money. So what's interesting about all this, right, causes a bank run. Bank run means exactly what you said, like you described from It's a Wonderful Life. People are like, whoa, this guy's going under. I have $300 million in a checking account there. I should probably go and get that before it's gone. And you get there and they're like, hey, we don't have that actually. So tough luck. Also, you're only insured up to $250,000. So that other, $299,975,000, maybe, good luck. We don't know. So obviously that's a big deal. And when, like you said, we're talking about the numbers and the companies and the kinds of people and companies that are invested in SVB, them not having money is a big problem. You're talking about, like we said, healthcare startups, tech startups, a lot of big money accounts. So what does the FDIC go ahead and do? They have this closed door meeting with the Federal Reserve over the weekend.
Yeah,
I read it.
in the office of the CEO of Goldman Sachs, right? Like
Who
not the one, they didn't come to DC. The people from DC went to New York to meet with him.
Yes. And interestingly, Goldman Sachs bought about $21.4 billion of that debt that SVB had, and they're poised to make $100 million off that deal.
And interestingly, so DC helped with this, but also, do you know who else helped with this? Is the government of California, who the governor is Gavin Newsom, who had money tied up in accounts at the Silicon Valley Bank.
Interesting.
Interesting.
So, having all this information, the question that I want to pose to you, AJ, and I want to kind of field your opinion on, because to me, I see this as one of the most important parts of the story. After this meeting with the FDIC and the Federal Reserve, they go ahead and they say, they inform Joe Biden of their decision. And Joe Biden seems to support this, according to all accounts that I've read. And they say, hey, we're going to go ahead and we're going to insure all of these deposits. We are going to make sure that if you had money in SVB, you get your money. Joe Biden doesn't call it a bailout.
Yeah,
Nobody's calling it a bailout. Nobody's calling it a bailout. But it seems to me like they bailed a lot of people out of a really, really bad situation. And the reason that they give is to prevent, this sort of domino effect where one bank goes, these other banks do these reassessments, which is sort of what we're seeing anyway. Like you mentioned, the Swiss bank only found out that their investments were risky because they did sort of a relook, a double back, and say, hey, we are very close to doing what those guys just did. We need some help. Do you think that this was the right thing to do? The FDIC goes ahead and for the first time ever, in their almost 100 years of existence, covers all of these deposits, which, like you said, Roku itself has $300 million sitting in a checking account when they damn well know that they are only insured up to $250,000.
Well, I don't know if I'm going to say I necessarily think it's the right thing or the wrong thing to do. To be completely honest, I can't give a good answer on that. But I could say this, a couple things. First of all, I think that it's quite clear that, well, let's put it this way. It took first of all, it's quite clear that it's a bailout. They say this is not a bailout. It's a bailout. Okay, sure. You're not saving SVB, but you're saving all of the people that put their money into SVB that could have seen how they were investing this money and been like, hold on, this doesn't make any sense, because it clearly didn't make any sense from the beginning. And these are not dumb people. These are people starting tech startups and healthcare startups. Like, these are clearly smart people, right? And you're bailing out companies like Roku that are putting hundreds of $1 million in one checking account. Like, how stupid can you be? Like, I don't have no sympathy for somebody like that. Do I have sympathy for the employee of that company that might not get paid because of it? Absolutely. I have no sympathy for the actual company or organization itself that's doing these stupid maneuvers. That being said, I think the most telling thing is how quickly it all came to fruition that they were going to bail it out. I think that they came up with this plan and they put it into effect within like 48 or 72 hours of the bank failing. Meanwhile, like, what's going on in Ohio, where still nothing is being resolved about that chemical crash, and now we don't really have to worry about it because we have this bank issue. So it's like we're going to deal with all of these millionaires and save all of them. Um, Fundamentally, my problem with this is it is once again our elite class, and this goes to the book that you're reading, but it's fundamentally our elite class failing us again. It's these elite bankers doing stupid things in investing that anybody with a half a brain cell could say, this doesn't really make much sense. It's our regulators not following up and being like, hey, this is sketchy. Maybe we should start to do something about this. It's our legislators pumping millions and or trillion, or probably like trillions of dollars into the economy without thinking, oh man, this is going to cause a crazy inflation cycle, right? It is the idea of our quote unquote experts, our quote unquote moral betters and logical betters and reasoning betters making bad decisions once again. And it's time and time again. And at the end of the day, they don't have to worry about their bad decisions because the FDIC and the Fed will bail them out. Even though we were told they wouldn't, they do it time and time again. There's no consequences to the actions. Why would you stop making these stupid decisions?
And I think important to add to that too is once the FDIC and the Fed came out, and this was a unanimous decision by all the board members on both of those organizations, they also extended that same offer to cover all of the depositors to Signature Bank out of Newark, which a few days later had suffered the same fate. So they did it back to back and are telling you it's not a bailout. Joe Biden got on TV, I believe it was Monday, and said the American taxpayer will not be on the hook for this.
Then who is?
Will not be on the hook. And you know who is? You know who is? Because I this is another thing. So where the FDIC gets this money from is all of the banks have these fees, obviously, that they charge onto customers, and a percentage of those fees go into this mutual insurance fund exactly for this type of situation. So it's not the taxpayers, it's just anybody who happens to have money in the bank,
which would be
most of the taxpayers.
Right.
See, I'm glad we got there together. So it's cronyism to me to sit here and say we're not bailing this out. This is not a bailout. I understand there's good intention in trying to prevent a domino effect, but you set a dangerous precedent also. If two boards who deal with the money, the interest rates, the returns on these bonds, all of these giant macroeconomic decisions over long periods of times, can have a closed door meeting in over 72 hours, say we all agree we are going to ignore the rules that were set in place by Congress. Congress had to approve that increase in covering money from 100,000 to 250,000. We are going to tell Congress, hey, kick rocks. We're in charge of this money, and this is what we're going to do with it. And we're not going to tell the American people.
And there's not going to be a lawsuit, because who does it help? It helps the big banks. It helps the big players in the market, which all of their money is saved. They don't care. Okay, it's a classic example of like big guy versus little guy here. And the big guy gets bailed out and the little guy gets screwed over, like always. It's Also, there's a lot of talk about deregulation playing an effect into this. With the under the Trump administration, there was a deregulation of the Dodd-Frank Act. Now, there's arguments that that deregulation had happened, but had nothing to do with this. I think that Bernie Frank himself, who like wrote the bill, was like, even if they didn't cut back the regulation, like this has nothing to do with the Dodd-Frank Act. Like, you're just finding a regulation that was drawn back and trying to blame it on that. Look, I don't know one way or the other, if I'm being completely honest. That is people. There are people that are talking about how regulation had the cut of regulation had a direct effect. Some say it had no effect. But at the end of the day, it is a failure of the people that are supposed to be smarter than you and I in handling this money. And now they're getting bailed out by the people that are supposed to be smarter than you and I, but all have interests in this. Every single one of them have an interest in this. Nancy Pelosi has an interest in this. Gavin Newsom has an interest in this. The FDIC and the Fed went to the CEO of Goldman Sachs, to his office, to issue this bailout. I think that alone is enough to tell you all you need to know.
I was going to say, if that's not telling, then by golly, I don't know what is.
They went to, like, you are the federal government of the United States. You are arguably the strongest institution in the world. And you kowtow to the CEO of Goldman Sachs, not the other way around. That's a problem. And look, I'm not a big government guy. You know that. I'm also not the biggest fan of big business. At the end of the day, I'd rather Goldman Sachs having to go on his knees to you than vice versa.
Every single day of the week.
Like,
every single day of the week. I think to your point, I also want to just address, because I was reading a lot about the claims, like you said, of the deregulation under the Trump administration or whatever. I'm not a banker. I'm not an expert. I'm not an economist. I didn't read the Dodd-Frank regulations that he pulled back. I don't know the semantics.
I want to be clear. It was under the Trump administration. Congress passed it.
Yes. I don't know the semantics of these things, right? What I do know is that there are patterns, at least in terms of the way that bankers engage, where government puts in regulation. Bankers say, right, we're going to be a little more conservative. We're going to act with a little more prudence because now we have these new things. Regulation gets repealed and they're like, woo, back to exactly what we were just doing. Like, the regulation itself, whatever it may regulate, I don't think is the material issue here. I think it's about punishing the behaviors and putting limits on the behaviors. And when something that was once impermissible becomes permissible again, if you made a lot of money doing it the first time and you didn't get in trouble the first time, and they put these regulations in, it's almost like you're in timeout. Somebody comes along and says, all right, back to it. Now we're here again. And that's why we have these cyclical ups and downs.
You won't have this problem if you don't bail them out every time, though. Like, I think that
Correct.
that's the where I think we can just come to this conclusion of, like, regulation or not, if we don't bail out these banks, they're not going to be making as many stupid decisions because they know they'll say, oh, hold on, there's consequences to our actions now.
Correct.
Right.
What the federal government did.
Whether the consequences through regulatory agencies, which really at the end of the day, like, how hard are they going to put down the hammer on these people? I don't think very hard. Or through actually, like, if you do this, we aren't going to save you. I think that holds more weight, but we can't do that.
No, they're too big to fail.
Well, that would. Oh, right. Where did I hear that before?
What the federal government did, what the FDIC did, what the Federal Reserve did this past week is they said, you guys made really risky long-term investments, didn't pay attention to what we were doing. We also didn't pay attention to what you were doing. And as a result of that, you guys are like down the river without a paddle. And we probably shouldn't. It's basically like you need 6 paddles to get out of the situation. We can only give you 2. We have a lot more of them. We're not supposed to give them to you. We're going to give you 10. And we're not going to tell anybody how or why we made that decision. we're just going to do it. And you guys can get your paddles and you can keep rowing down the river until this happens again and again and again and
And the
again.
same people that profited off of it, 15 years ago, are profiting again.
Yep.
And the same people that are hurting from it are going to be hurting again.
Exactly.
It is. I struggle even saying it's a failure of our expert class, because at this point it seems like it's not a failure for Goldman Sachs.
No,
It's a
they're making
major
$100 million.
Right. It's a major success. It's not necessarily a failure for the government, because they can look like the heroes.
Yeah,
even
Joe
though they're not.
Biden got on TV and told us it was going to be okay. Janet Yellen made a great decision to save the American banking system. But in saving it, you then permit it to continue to make the same mistakes that it's made for over 100 years now. Is that really saving it?
Is that even capitalism at this point? No, it's not. It's corporatism. And people are going to blame capitalism for this. It's not capitalism. Because guess what capitalism would have done? Would have let those banks fail. Because that's what competition and market does. This is corporatism. This is cronyism, like you said. This is the combination of banking, the banking industry, and the government working together for their own benefit.
I think I love stories like this simply for the fact that it is a rare occurrence where you and I both can sit here with the same disdain in our hearts for exactly what you just said. Corporatism, cronyism, and rich people basically passing the buck back and forth. And in their passing it, every time the ball gets exchanged, somebody, probably Goldman Sachs, makes $100 million. And also when that ball gets exchanged, somebody, probably a parent of 2 kids who lives in a nice middle-class home, loses their job.
Right.
And, I don't really care about Goldman Sachs making $100 million. I care about those people being able to have their money to pay their bills, feed their kids, and do what they have to do.
Exactly. And so that's where it's like the $250,000 that was being saved, that can be saved by the FDIC. Like, I have no problem with that, because guess who that's really helping? That's really helping that middle-class family that you described, because guess what? That middle-class family doesn't have $250,000 in their bank account.
I think it is important. The average bank has more than half of their deposits underneath that FDIC insured level of $250,000.
And SVB had 90% over. This was not a bank that was dealing with these middle class, This wasn't
regular
TD Bank.
people. It wasn't TD Bank.
Right. It wasn't TD Bank. It was the bank for it was bank for venture capitalists. It was bank for people starting tech startups in San Francisco. Like, this isn't a poor person bank or a middle class person bank. This is a rich person bank. And will middle class people and poor people be affected if those companies go under? Yeah, probably, because they're the employees of that. And that's a shame. And we should do something to help those people. Those people who were not the ones acting risky. Those people were just getting their paycheck from their job. They didn't do anything wrong.
Yet they bear the burden and they suffer the consequences of poor decisions from people who sit on these boards and have closed door meetings.
Who are much smarter than you and I, Stephen. Right. I think that's a good place to end this, though.
I would agree.
If you want more information, I will say this, and I will recommend Breaking Points. It's Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty, and there are 2 people. One's on the right, one's on the left, kind of like Stephen and I, and they have broken down this issue really, really well. And I think that I highly recommend that show if you want more information from people that are actually more in depth, knowing what's going on about this type of stuff. I think that they do a great job over there. And honestly, anything that brings people together, ideologies that are different together, I think we should support on this show. I'm sure if they knew about us, they would support us as well. So,
100 times over.
Yeah, so I would check that out if you want more information. I think they've done a good job breaking it down this week.
Yeah. I got nothing. I got nothing for you.
All right, so everybody, as always, this is another episode of Bridging the Gap. You can subscribe over at Jersey First TV on YouTube. You can check us out on jerseyfirst.org. and you can sign up for the newsletter and sign up for our pledge. And yeah, and I hope you all have a wonderful week. We will talk to you all next week. I'm AJ Malillo.
I'm Stephen Rambolo.
See you, everybody.